Well, anyway, I just want to welcome everyone on behalf of SSGN. And, our purpose is personal transformation of our consciousness in the service of sustainably healing the earth. So I think that that's a pretty broad objective, but I am hoping that tonight we can look at pragmatic ways in which we can carry that out. So Ensign, if you can please introduce Gary.
Yeah, I
And
want to say I'd love to. I'd love to. Gary Schoeniger is an outstanding entrepreneur in his own right, and that will become apparent as he tells you the story of how he's done what he's done. He's a published author now of two books, joint book with a fellow named Beautiful Man as well. The first book, Who Owns the Ice House, and now his own book, the very signatory special book about the entrepreneurial mindset advantage. And as Gary will explain, it's not what you might think when we mention entrepreneurial. Gary has been a leading advocate for entrepreneurial mindset education, professional development in classrooms, organizations, and communities. His approach is to democratize entrepreneurship rather than be something that's about venture financing and business development. Oh, that's definitely important, but that's not what he's here to talk to us about. It's not about necessarily starting a business and financing it and business plans and all this stuff. It's about the entrepreneurial mindset, the agency, the mindset, attitudes, and beliefs and orientation. And Gary, we're so thrilled to have you with us. Please take it away.
Thank you, Ensign. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and kind of share with you guys some of my ideas around the entrepreneurial mindset. I want to take maybe 15 minutes or so and sort of lay out the basic thesis that I've stumbled across in my work. And then I'd like to engage with you in some dialogue about how these ideas might contribute to or enhance or somehow coalesce with your ideas about sustainability and human flourishing. And as Ensign intimated, the word entrepreneur is received often very, very differently from people. And some people hear the word and they receive it negatively. Some people hear the word and they're agnostic. I don't want to start a business. I don't necessarily, I'm not anti-entrepreneurial, but I'm really trying to broaden the conversation beyond just startup, as Ensign said. So I've been on this journey for 33 years now, essentially trying to understand I set out to address like a very simple question, which is essentially, how do underdogs win? How do people that have nothing create something? And I very quickly recognized that they're all entrepreneurial, and I'll define that for you in a minute, my definition. I'll argue that the current definitions are woefully narrow and antiquated and so forth. But I set out to, and I started as an anthropologist, I started to interview everyday entrepreneurs. And again, I'm not interested in the mindset of Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or, Donald Trump. I'm interested in understanding the mindset of people who start with nothing and create something. And I started on this journey very naive, as these things sometimes go. But I was going about it from the perspective of anthropologists, as an anthropologist. Like, I don't really care that you made a lot of money. I mean, that's all fine. I don't resent that. I don't have a problem with that. But I really wanted to understand the mindset. And as I started interviewing hundreds of entrepreneurs, I began to notice, And I mean everyday underdog entrepreneurs, people that came from poverty, that had disabilities, that were in jail, that came from adverse poverty, that, from South Africa, from all over Latin America, from Cameroon, And what I began to notice was a common and predictable pattern of underlying beliefs and assumptions of which the entrepreneurs themselves were largely unaware. That's why I'm so keen on mindset. To this day, you can go listen to my podcast. I have, 50 of them or so. I don't know how many on my podcast. They're dumbfounded. This often happens after we stop recording, when the entrepreneurs are dismayed to learn that they've actually been following any kind of a predictable pattern of beliefs and behaviors. So that's why I'm so keen on mindset. And we talked about this earlier this morning, but there's a lot of popular psychology that leads us to believe that entrepreneurs are somehow born with some rare mystical traits. And I've looked at the literature here. It just doesn't hold up. So in any case, the more I began to study this, my first book, Who Owns the Ice House, was inspired by one entrepreneur that I interviewed, Clifton Talbert, who's done many, many things in his life. One of which is he was one of the early partners in the company that brought Stairmaster to life, the exercise equipment. And when I interviewed Clifton in 2008, I asked him, how did you learn how to think like an entrepreneur? Which is more or less how I start the conversation. Like, do you believe you were born entrepreneurial, or was there a person or a situation in your life that pushed you on this track? And Clifton pulled that picture out of a shoebox, the black and white, that's the original picture of his Uncle Cleve. And he explained to me that he was born in the Mississippi Delta in the 1940s to a teenage mom, didn't know a father. And he said, all I could see in every direction was cotton fields. And that was the expected way of life, except for the fact that when he was 13, his Uncle Cleve kind of brought him under his wing and taught him how to think like an entrepreneur. And, he described his Uncle Cleve from the perspective of a 13-year-old boy. Clifton was 65 at the time I interviewed him in 2008, something like that, in his early 60s. He said, there was something different about my uncle, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. He walked differently. He talked differently. He was the only person in our little cotton community that had money in the bank. And we weren't allowed to go in the front door. We had to go in the back door. But he had money in the bank. And so at the time, I didn't know that he was a Pulitzer nominee, that he had written a dozen books and made major motion pictures and done all these other things. I convinced him a year later that we were going to co-write this book, Who Owns the Ice House? 8 Life Lessons from an Unlikely Entrepreneur, which we did co-author. It's gone all over the world. It's become an international bestseller. We developed a curriculum around it that's being taught in classrooms and communities all over the world. South Africa is part of that. But almost immediately, once Ice House was done, like released and out there, and we were hosting like entrepreneurial mindset facilitator trainings at the Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City. And people started showing up and inquiring about this. And I remember, I forgot the guy's name. He was the interim president of Kauffman, the former president of Yale University. And he said to me, like, this Ice House thing might be the best goddamn thing Kauffman's ever done, which sort of startled me, I thought like I was just a little gnat in their whole universe. But it was a moment of recognition that I'm onto something. And almost immediately I realized I needed to dig deeper. In my newer book, which I just published, it just came out in December, is a continuation of the stories, but I delved into the literature and behavioral economics and psychology, social psychology and anthropology to explain why some people behave this way and other people don't. And that's really where I stumbled into something much, much bigger than I ever could have imagined. And I don't know if you can see the subtitle of the new book, but it says, "The Hidden Logic That Unleashes Human Potential." Now, I would forgive you for tossing that off as hyperbole if you walk past it in a bookstore. But I think when you start to delve into it, you'll see that it's not. And one of the things that Ensign and Jim and I talked about earlier today is the banality of heroism, the banality of amazing. And I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the banality of evil and the work of Hannah Arendt. And the basic idea is, we know how to create conditions where good people will do bad things. This is about the banality of heroism. I kept interviewing entrepreneurs, many of whom I could not for the life of me distinguish any particular brilliance or charisma or creativity, nothing in their personality. In fact, many times I was sort of scratching my head thinking to myself, I don't get it. Like, this guy started with a $5,000 loan from his mother-in-law 10 years ago, and he's working on this thing. I just met a guy in Minneapolis last week. He's a chicken farmer. Asked the question, is there a way we can pull humidity out of the air so my chickens have access to water? And the guy's like a high school graduate. He went to the university and asked a bunch of engineers, and they figured it out. I keep seeing these stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. So that's the basic idea, but and I really would rather have you guys ask me questions than lecture at you all evening. I think that's the basic idea is out there. One of the things, I put a slide in here, and I don't know if all of you can see it. I'm going to put it back in the chat here so that everyone has access to it. One of the things that I realized in my research is that a mindset is to a person what culture is to a group. And that was a major advancement in my understanding. And I then realized that in my reading and studying anthropology, the first rule of anthropology is you can't understand another culture. You can't begin to understand another culture until you realize that you are looking at the world through your own cultural lens or your own mindset, whatever you want to call it. And that's when I realized that the entrepreneurial mindset only seems enigmatic to us to the extent that we are steeped in managerial thinking, which is sort of other-directed, top-down, efficiency-based. And we need that. That's not to denigrate that, but the bigger idea that sort of emerged is that once I started to understand self-determination theory and, what are the conditions in which humans flourish? Let me back up one step. one of the ideas in my book came from like motivation research, which is these scholars from Rochester, University of Rochester in the 90s kind of brought us out of the dark ages of B.F. Skinner's behaviorism. Do this and you'll get that. And what these guys show, it's called self-determination theory. And the premise is quite simple. Human beings are no different than any other organism insofar as we are born with the capacity and the desire to become all that we can become. But that self-actualizing tendency can easily be thwarted by a whole constellation of cognitive, motivational, and situational factors, most of which are within our control, but control requires awareness. And what they're saying, what these guys are saying is that we need autonomy, we need competency, and we need relatedness, which is a clunky word for purpose. We need to be recognized for our contribution to our community. In the absence of any one of those three psychological nutrients, human flourishing is thwarted. You need all three. And so part of my theory is that the typical entrepreneur blindly stumbles into that trifecta of autonomy, of competence, and purpose. They're pursuing something that has meaning to them in a way that creates value for other people. And by doing so, they become optimally engaged. They become intrinsically motivated. They get access to problem-solving abilities that are not otherwise available. So that's just it in a nutshell. What I want to hear from you all is, how does this fit in your world of sustainability? How do these ideas fit? I mean, Ensign and Jim and I talked about some things earlier today, but I'd love to take questions or engage in a dialogue. And if I missed anything important, Jim or Ensign, please speak up.
Gary, I think that's a great intro. And I think we do exactly want to go after what you just talked about and get questions. But let me because I think the backstory of how you got in is so interesting. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little more about how you even ever got onto the trail, sort of personally and on the entrepreneurship. I know from Clifton onward, when you wrote the book together.
Yeah.
But more backstory. How did you even? You were an entrepreneur sort of day one. You had a sandwich shop. I mean, you did stuff. I mean.
Yeah. So I was like not a great student in school. And by the way, this is something that I feel very passionate about. Like, I now seen the data from Gallup. The longer a student stays in school, the less engaged they become. It goes down, 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 down. In fifth grade, 75% of kids are engaged in learning, which that's already deplorable in my view, because the desire to learn is innate. That's how an organism orients itself in this domain. Fifth grade, 75% of kids are engaged. By 12th grade, it's 35%. And that was my experience. I did reasonably well through middle school, through elementary school. And when I got in middle school, the wheels fell off the wagon. I started abusing drugs and alcohol in high school. I don't even know how I graduated. Like, Jim, you were talking about like you slipped through the cracks. That was me. Like, I think I had like a 2.2 GPA, but somebody fudged that because that doesn't seem possible. But I found out as an entrepreneur that I love to learn. And that's part of something that we can talk about that belongs in the universe, in the conversation about sustainability. That I told Ensign and Jim today, like, I studied evolutionary psychology. The desire to learn is innate. Learning is supposed to feel exciting and rewarding. It should be something that we look forward to, that energizes us. It's not supposed to be drudgery or something to be endured. We've completely lost sight of that. So anyway, to answer Ensign's question very quickly, I was a horrible student. I found myself out in the world. I had nor the inclination nor the academic scores to get into college. I was already pretty well into alcoholism, smoking a fair amount of weed at the time. And like most people in that situation, I went through a series of mind-numbing, low-paying jobs. And I stumbled into an entrepreneurial opportunity, and you know, I started to realize that I'm making as much money as any of my friends that went off to college and got good grades, and
Right.
you know, I was doing as well, and I was just as happy as any of them. You know, so that's how I got into it. But I want to be clear about something. I am not the guy who says I am an entrepreneur, therefore I know all there is to know about entrepreneurship. I hate that guy. I'm not him. I'm saying I've studied entrepreneurship. I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of entrepreneurs around the world. I've studied the literature, but I also am one. I've lived it. This is part of lived experience, which is, I think, where you're going with that, Ensign.
No, many communities in America and around the world have been become unsustainable because they're, you know, whether it's outsourcing of industry out of the country as a result of unbridled globalism, or maybe too narrow a focus of the community. And you know, one of our interests at SSGN is the development of sustainable, what you could call eco villages. Now, I guess there's really, a village is also a community, and I guess a community can be based on a geographic area, and it can also be a virtual one online. And one of my interests is, how do we release the creative energies of people who have given up hope in these impoverished communities, and to restore life and vitality and variety and interest, and you know, those contribute towards sustainability. And I think that many things, such as the revival of arts and crafts, festivals, culinary aspects, nature, you know, nature, how could you say, ecology tourism. You could also have particular skills. You can even have music, the local musical traditions and craft traditions. So much of this has been lost in this economic despair in many of the
Yeah.
smaller
Yeah,
communities. And
yeah,
how can
Gary,
we restore that?
Gary, maybe you could comment on what, you know, the managerial mindset, which you referenced earlier, and where we are because of the, you know, massive growth of big corporations, and most people thinking getting a degree to get a ticket to be inside a big firm. It could be a service firm or a big manufacturing firm, or now an AR firm or something like that, versus charting your own way, which is, you know, independent and risk taking and all of that, you know, and contrast those for us, and in
Yeah.
the world
And
we are in today.
I think I have some of the answers to your question, Jim. I don't have them all, but the answers are in social psychology, because what we're really talking about here is a social intervention. That's ultimately what we're talking about here. So, where to begin? You know, I I encounter people every day. I travel a lot. I encounter service workers in airports, in Uber cars, hotels, and whatnot. And I meet so many people that are sharp, that are, eager. They're Uber drivers are a good litmus test, because usually an Uber driver is somebody that's got hustle in them. They're trying to do their own thing, but they don't realize, like, the phone is their boss. They don't have a human boss, but they're being manipulated. They're still not thinking for themselves. But to your point, Jim, I think that there are millions and millions of people in the United States, billions of people more broadly, who are languishing, not because they're incapable, but because they weren't great students in school. And so they're thinking, this being a bartender or an Uber driver is all I can do. And it's really, the question you're getting at is, like, what price are we paying for overlooking this reservoir, this massive reservoir of human potential that we just can't access with managerial paradigms? We can't get to it with school systems, with other directed top-down learning environments that rely on punishments and rewards. We can't get to it within hierarchical systems where only a few can get to the top and everybody else is left to just slug it out. I could make the argument that the Industrial Revolution, and the division of labor had its moment. But I feel like that we're kind of at the end of that. Like, we just became obsessed with efficiency, and it's left so many people on the margins. People who are capable of more, are desirous of more.
I think the other thing, Gary, isn't it about, in unsettled or chaotic or very rapidly evolving times, that the just wanting to fit into a system is ill suited to deal with extemporaneous and rapidly evolving stuff, where you have to think for yourself.
That's really, Jim and Nancy and I talked about this earlier. I was on a webinar from these scholars from Harvard who wrote a book called Employment is Dead. Like, that's happening. That is a thing. But what they're saying is essentially what I'm saying, is that to the extent that we rely on someone else to tell us what to learn and do in order to be successful, is the extent to which we will become increasingly vulnerable in a VUCA world, in a hyper-connected AI world. But for people who, so I define entrepreneurship as the self-directed pursuit of opportunity to create value for others. And I'll write that in the chat if you want me to. It took me 25 years to come up with that definition. If you look up the definition of entrepreneurship, it's going to tell you it's somebody who takes a risk in exchange for a profit. I just think that's utterly vulgar. It's like that characterizes the entrepreneur as someone who's solely driven by profit. It's so misleading. I've interviewed 700 entrepreneurs. I've seen very little evidence of that. Almost to a person, there's a purpose-driven component to what they're doing. Betty Jean.
Yes. Thank you so much for introducing this topic. I'm enjoying it. I was thinking, when you ask about the mindset of an entrepreneur, could it be someone so devoted to help others that they find ways to define what is missing around them and try to fill the void. And
Yeah.
then it's,
You're asking an important question, Betty Jean, and I think my first book, The Ice House, really revealed this. The thing that Uncle Cleve understood, Clifton's uncle that owns the Ice House, is that we blind ourselves to opportunities when we're trying to get our own needs met. And we discover opportunities when we realize it's an other orientation. Remember, my definition is about the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others. That's what Uncle Cleve demonstrated. People need ice, they need firewood, they need coal, they need their cars fixed. He had a 4th grade education, but he picked books out of the garbage so he could educate himself. He went to sit on the porch of the Jewish merchant in the next town who owned the local grocery store. Like he was networking with other entrepreneurs. And as Clifton will tell you, regardless of the way he was treated, he treated everybody the same. But the idea here, Betty, is really the human flourishing component you're getting at. We are right now living in the most opportunity-rich time in human history, but you can't see those ideas, you can't recognize those opportunities through a managerial lens. So I would say that empathy is the core component of opportunity recognition. But I want to put an asterisk in your question, Betty, because I want to double click on it for a second, because I think of this as like an altruistic paradox. It's not about just you being a martyr and being an altruist and just giving of yourself. It's not that. It's a way of giving of yourself in ways in which you flourish.
Mm.
So that's how I think about it.
Interesting. That's good.
But I also think that my definition of entrepreneurship is the self-directed pursuit of opportunity to create value for others. Lana, are you back in Madison? Oh, okay. It looks like you're in Madison. Sorry. The reason I like that definition is because anyone can embrace it. You can show up at your job tomorrow at Taco Bell and show up 15 minutes early, stay 15 minutes late, and watch how quickly opportunity finds you. We are not here to serve ourselves. Look, the ancients wrote about this. Aristotle wrote about this, right? You can't really fully live until you commit yourself to something bigger than you. Yeah, you can get a good job and enrich your life and your family and have nice things. That's a recipe for a good life. But for a meaningful, full life, you have to contribute to something bigger than you. And again, the entrepreneurs stumble into that unwittingly, in my view.
Gary, isn't it true that the entrepreneurs really haven't even examined it or gotten intellectual about it in a lot of cases? It's when you interview them, they say, "Oh yeah, I guess maybe
that's it." And I hate to even mention his name, but goddamn, I learned more about entrepreneurship from Karl Marx than anybody. It's so counterintuitive, right? But read what he wrote about alienation theory, why the worker is alienated from his work. He's alienated from his work because he's alienated from his species' essence. It was Marx himself who said that the desire to fulfill human needs through our own efforts is an essential part of what makes us human. And Maslow went further and said, when that ability is either suppressed or denied, we get sick. Sometimes immediately, sometimes later, sometimes in obvious ways, sometimes in not obvious ways. So I really think that human beings, we're evolved. We come into this life with some sort of interest and abilities. I call them gifts. And it's our duty to figure out how to use our gifts to make ourselves useful to other humans with our gifts. Nobody ever tells us that. We're still so steeped in industrial era thinking. The moment you set foot in first grade, it is assumed that you're going to be an employee, that you're going to work in an established company. You're going to fulfill a predetermined role. You're going to be other direct. Somebody else is going to tell you what's useful, and you're going to do it in exchange for your pay. I'm sorry. That's an impoverished view of the human spirit. One could argue that at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, the barriers to entry were enormous. We were illiterate peasant farmers, and you needed a lot of money to build a loom factory or whatever the hell. But the barrier to entry now is in your phone. You got access to 2 billion people in most of the world's knowledge for $15 a month. But that managerial mindset is still lingering, and it's a form of learned helplessness. We're walking around with an unconscious assumption that I am who I am and the world is the way it is. And all I can do is find a job and try to save a little bit of money and try to fit in. And it's just an impoverished view. But I'm intrigued by the idea, for the potential for these ideas to be part of the broader conversation around sustainability.
And that's why Gary, that's why we're so excited to have you with us today, because what SSGN has been all about is what I call, or we call, eco-spirituality, but I like better calling it earth care spirituality, meaning the broader purpose, which is certainly empathic, which is to care about all of creation, all of our fellow creatures, and even rocks and trees and stuff like that. And that's the notion of sustainability we're talking about. We're talking human flourishing from a long-term sustainable, meaning we don't drive ourselves into the ground and destroy the garden earth that we inherited. And so I think what you're talking about is terribly relevant to the situation today. And earlier today, we talked about the dysfunction of starting to teach to test. And you did the as you said, the mindset experiment for the college. Why don't you tell us that story? Because I think it's very relevant.
Which story? I'm sorry.
The teacher that you were at the university and said, "Hey, let's do this experiment about if we."
Well, it started with a conversation. It was giving some lectures to some deans at a college in Atlanta, University of Western Georgia, and a lot of the deans were expressing angst about kids cheating with AI. And I'm just shaking my head. Like, no one is asking the question, why do you think they're cheating? They're cheating because they are extrinsically motivated. They don't care about the knowledge. They want the piece of paper. They want to get the hell out of there. And so I said, let's do a thought experiment. Let's pretend that we're the president of University of Western Georgia, and we're addressing the rising juniors of the class of 2027. And we have them all amassed in an auditorium. And we're saying, boys and girls, today is your lucky day. We're going to hand out your diplomas 2 years in advance. You don't have to come back if you don't want to. We think you should, but you're free to go if you want to. How many kids are back there in the fall? Of course, we don't know, but it makes my point nevertheless, that school and work is reliant upon extrinsic motivation or threat of punishment. And human flourishing cannot occur within those paradigms. It's very, very unlikely. But I think the human flourishing thing is tied to your work. Because I can be concerned about the environment. I can be concerned about sustainability. But if I don't have a sense of agency, I'm just gonna become racked with anxiety.
Yeah.
Or I'm
And
gonna
that's what
sit around,
isn't that
I'm
what
gonna
your
sit
work-
around talking about it
Mhm.
as a proxy for doing something about it.
And isn't that what your work and your book and all that is all about? Is trying to help people with that.
100%, 100%.
Yeah.
You know, the way I would say this, Ensign, is like, there's something called the overview effect that occurs. It's a psychological phenomenon that occurs to astronauts. If they've been in outer space and they see the Earth, you know, from afar, this little blue ball hanging out there, and they see that we're just this tiny village in this huge universe, and they see the insanity of war and famine and conflict and destruction and environmental destruction and so forth. And they come back to Earth and they quit their job. They cease to be astronauts and they become involved in some sort of humanitarian endeavors. That's what happened to me. I've seen a side of humanity. There are 10 people on this planet at most that have seen what I've seen. I've seen the extraordinary ability of ordinary people. People, you know, dropouts and misfits and C students, people that our systems of education have just spit out like a chicken bone. You know, people that have been rejected within these narrow confines of academia. You know, and there's a joke among us entrepreneurs. And it goes like this. The A students wind up teaching B students how to work for the C students. Anyway, I want to keep coming back to the sustainability thing. I think, you know, if we don't have a sense of agency, we're just not going to take any meaningful action. And part of what I wrote about in my new book, The Mindset Advantage, is I did a much deeper dive in the entrepreneurial process. And what that looks like is this is an inexperienced, unfunded entrepreneur. They don't have any big ideas. They're not inventing anything new. They're experimenting. They're trying lots of little things. And their first idea is a bad idea. Probably their second or third idea is a bad idea. But through continuous experimentation and adaptation, they uncover things that can't otherwise be seen. They can't be identified with a business plan and market data because the data don't exist. And so, I don't know. I just think, and the other aspect of this connection that I'm eager to explore is, look, if you're going to a job, if you're languishing, if you're going to a job that doesn't fill your cup, you know, you're coming home exhausted at the end of the day. And it's not because you were laying bricks all day. It's because your soul's getting sucked right out of you. That's why you're exhausted. And you know, people get caught in that trap, and then they don't have the capacity to worry about the planet. They don't have the capacity to worry about their neighbors. So I think that the dimension of this work is about, we have to figure out how to get our own basic needs met. And this maybe is a conundrum, because in order to get our needs met, we have to be engaged in some sort of purpose-driven work. I don't know.
Walter, Donald, please, questions from your vantage point.
Yeah, I've seen the way he understands sustainability. I can understand entrepreneurship, but I want to be clear how he's using sustainability. Are you hearing me?
Yeah. So I
Can
think.
you clarify how you are using sustainability? Because the spirituality and sustainability global network. How are you using sustainability?
So I did put the traditional definition that came out of the Brundtland Commission in 1987, which is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And it's basically a three-legged stool representing three dimensions: environmental, economic, and social. And so that is the classic sustainability definition it's used in the environment. But one of the things that you taught me after many months, Gary, and I appreciate all the time we spent together on that previous network, or that previous Zoom or series of Zoom calls, was that the most important thing that anyone can do in our species is make the species survive. And so, I mean, that's the role of all of us, is survival. And so we all have to have that survival of the earth. And on an individual level, we need to have a survival of our own selves. But we can only do that if we benefit the community. So we cannot have a successful entrepreneur activity if it doesn't provide benefit to our community.
Well,
yeah,
I think it's important to distinguish between survival and flourishing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, yeah, we can, you know, live in abject poverty, or we can go to a job and you know, make a lot of money. I know plenty of lawyers that make $400,000 a year, and they're ready to blow their brains out at any given moment.
Mm-hmm.
And Ensign and Jim and I talked about this earlier. I think of these two words, Walter, like meaning and prosperity. And this is sort of maybe a side, maybe I'm diverting a bit away from your question, but I don't think you can have prosperity without meaning. And I don't think you can have meaning without prosperity. Like, you have to benefit. And this is, you know, this idea of flourishing, of the individual stumbles into this conditions that are conducive to human flourishing, let's say. Those are the entrepreneurial conditions. Those are the conditions for human flourishing. And I guess what I'm hearing myself say, Walter, is that human flourishing and sustainability are synonymous, I guess. That you know, I put Pareto efficiency in there, which is the idea that you can't improve anything if that improvement is harmful to some part of the system.
Okay, so human flourishing as a working definition of sustainability, I can zero in on that. But to go to the broadland definition, that is a developmental issue. It's a macro issue. Because most people use sustainability as work and survive from one generation to another generation. Some people say it's sustainable if it can go from me to my children to my grandchildren.
Yeah.
And they are not thinking of whether it's environmental or equitable and all that. They still say sustainability. So that's why I wanted you to clarify. But I can understand when you say flourishing and meaning, which is almost like man's search for meaning. I guess that we must, without a meaning, we can just walk and get tired, like you're saying. The point I'm trying to make it practical, most times we do research and write these books as professors, but for those in the field, you see that for the chap who had a role model, you mentioned the guy who learned from his uncle, there are many people who don't even have a role model. There are
Well, and
many.
that's something we've got to fix. Like it's difficult to be it if you can't see it. I can't agree with you more. I mean, and in higher education, there's a contempt for entrepreneurship. That the entrepreneur is characterized as just an exploitative, profit-seeking person. They're negatively construed. As my friends in South Africa say, Walter, when you mention entrepreneurship, that's when the teacher gets up to go make tea.
You're correct.
But this is something that I've done probably better than anyone in the world, is helped educators understand entrepreneurship from a different perspective, from a human flourishing perspective. When I say to you that when a human being is able to autonomously pursue his or her interests and develop his or her abilities in ways that contribute to the community, that individual, those are the conditions that lead to human flourishing. That is not a religious or a moral or an Eastern or a Western philosophical perspective. That's biology. It's a biological phenomenon. It has nothing to do with morality or religion.
I agree.
Donald,
And
please, he has a question, I think, or go ahead.
okay, you go ahead.
Gary, this has been so fascinating, especially I've been talking about human flourishing and in very many different ways. One of the stark realities that stacks up as you talk about it, and from my own experience and my own encounter, is the juxtaposition of what we see on a very, very, we see it almost on a daily basis. It seems as if there is a contempt for the destruction of human flourishing. In our work, in our civilization, in our politics, in almost everything that we do. Because the point is always about destruction. It's not about giving up the opportunities for someone to flourish. But I've been saying this for quite some time in my own experience. In an era of true abundance, when we really have a lot, and when we have so much that is so diversible on a global level, what we do that shows to the world is always about right and might, And we are constantly, even as we are on this level, trying to identify sustainability and flourishing at this time, we have a situation where we are destroying. There is war in Israel. You can go on, you can go that path and just constantly going that. We are looking at the people whom, to take Gary's point, have braved and taken the entrepreneurial spirit and gone further. We don't class them as people who follow the norm. We see them as people
As
who-
exceptional.
Yes, exceptional people who just broke, and actually not dudes that I would like to play with on a daily basis, because they will say, "Oh, you're not playing with the right cadre of people."
You're
But I like-
deviating from cultural norms.
Exactly. But I really, truly see all that you are saying, and I've been trying to say that in very different ways. I just put up a write-up on memories, dangerous memories that we create on a daily basis in our economies, in our commerce, in our
Yeah.
relationship, and all of those things. So
Don-
then it begs the question of how do we flourish and encourage entrepreneurial spirit that I grew up with. And I like that point. I've always said it. Ensign by now knows me. I'm a child of wonder. Once we started growing, we came up with beautiful ideas to the 5th grade. I still live those days. Those are the days that keep me going when situations are really down, because that's where I flourish. That's where I'm able to think and create my own world and talk to my students. But it's diminished because you are stacked up against realities that, does not encourage anything about human flourishing, but gives you a picture of defeat and might and right. So
Yeah.
Gary, help me out. How do we create, because I really want
Yeah.
to stay with the sustainability match.
Okay.
Well, Donald, we've agreed with Gary to continue the discussion beyond tonight's thing and working with SSGN.
Well,
And I think
let
it
me
might
take
be-
a stab at
Yeah, go ahead, Gary.
the
But
question.
also talk about the curve thing. I think that's very important, that illustration.
Yeah. But Donald, I can't help but invoke Viktor Frankl from your comments. The last of the human freedoms is the ability to choose the way we respond. And one of the aspects of an entrepreneurial mindset that I've studied to a considerable extent is optimism. And I acknowledge that there's a hereditary component to optimism. But I also know from the literature that we can train ourselves to be optimistic, even if we are dispositionally prone to be more depressive or pessimistic. The psychological benefits of optimism are very, very difficult to overstate. Increased immune function, longer lifespan, lower all-cause mortality, lower cancer, lower heart disease, all these things. And so you bring me to the right question, Donald, which is this. If I had to break it down to one simple thing that distinguishes the entrepreneurial mindset from a non-entrepreneurial mindset, it's a compelling goal. Every entrepreneur you'll ever talk to, there's something in their mind, they're striving. There's a meaningful, purposeful thing. They can see it in their minds. It doesn't exist yet. Now, look, there's really fantastic literature coming out about this, that future positive cognitive orientation enables us to access problem-solving abilities that you don't otherwise have access to. If you talk to an entrepreneur, they're going to start talking about their vision. And what I ask people all the time is, do you have a compelling goal? And if not, why not? That's a mindset problem, right? Now, here's what I would say, and I'm happy to talk about this over time. But if I were you guys, I'd figure out how to make a middle school entrepreneurial sustainability handbook, find somebody with 10 million bucks and launch an international sustainability competition for middle schoolers, like the Science Olympiad. That's what I would do. You know, was Frederick Douglass said, it's like, it's easier to build strong children than to fix broken men. But the optimism is the answer to your question, Donald. It's like, you know, I've interviewed all these underdog entrepreneurs, many of whom are come from minority. They're minorities. They come from all kinds of, you know, abject poverty and whatnot. And it took me a while to realize this, but what they're not saying is more important than what they are saying. None of them, none, zero, are focusing on how unfair the world is. You know, I can't get ahead because I'm Black or because I'm a woman. I'm not denying that those barriers are there. It's just not the dog they feed.
Can we associate that with what we normally call interruption, societal interruption, which means that other factors have taken precedence into the authentic life that we were thought to live?
Betty Jean, I need you to say more about that. I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, I think we've been talking about, been listening about, you know, what's the word again? Excuse my getting old, art of forgetting.
The mindset?
Yeah, we're talking about coming back to, hold on a second, I'll get the word here. Sustainability. And the reference has been, okay, how do we conserve that? How do we start keeping our children engaged in terms of into interest missions that really get them, will help them stay happy, go toward achieving things that they like to do, right? That's how you become sustainable, and then you are you progress, you flourish in a sense.
Correct.
And my question slash comment that came to mind was more like, can we associate this lack of interest? Well, I call it interest, or lack of flourishing into, excuse me? Motivation, thank you. To the fact that we have a lot of noise these days in this particular era that we probably didn't have before. And these noises could be a number of things. Could be, you know, like you said, like what James was saying,
like trade barriers,
using our RAN. You can hear me?
I say like trade barriers, like barriers around you, tariffs.
Yeah, like, you know, crafts, and now kids spend less time outdoors, you know, small things that really used to make a difference. And we now seeing the effect of it, now that we are not really, when we thought that it was normal, and now that they move away, we realize that, they brought in inspiration and so many things that we now wish we could use. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but somehow it sounds.
I understand, Betty. I think, you know, I believe that non-entrepreneurial behavior is learned. That we're all born curious, we're all born with creative potential, we're all born with an innate desire to contribute. I was building a mid-century modern bench weaving Danish cord with my cousin's 2-year-old grandson. And he came over and he said, I help. Like, that's a natural impulse in a human. And we are systematically marching young people down this industrial era pathway that is guaranteed. It's almost guaranteed that they will become disengaged. And by the way, teachers and students are alienated from learning and teaching for precisely the same reasons that Marx cited in his letter to James Mill in the 1840s. For the worker is disengaged. Exactly the same reasons. They're alienated from their species essence.
Jim, I think that we've had a great discussion tonight, and in respect of everybody's time, and I know we could go on and maybe have Gary back for another session, but I think it may be time to call a wrap to tonight. What do you think, Jim? You're the moderator.
Well, unfortunately, I've been enjoying it so much, and I think there's so many interesting things, but that have been said tonight, and certainly give us a lot of pause for further conversation. I think we're just scratching the surface. But anyway, we are going to have, I just wanted to say before we ended that we will be having our next conversation on May the 8th with Alan Otero from Nairobi, Kenya. So, but we will hope to be in dialogue with Gary again on taking this discussion further. So on that note, I think I'd like to say how much I enjoyed tonight. Thank you very much.
And the recording will be on our YouTube channel and be accessible to distribute to your friends and other people interested. And we think this is very important to long-term and sustainable human flourishing. And right now, we think those of us that see the trajectory of human impacts on the biosphere as being ultimately self-destructive to the point, conceivably in the worst case, of extinction, it's really important that what we've been talking about tonight really goes out and helps other people to get into the sustainability entrepreneurial mindset.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
Gary.
you, everyone. Great to be here. Great to see you, Lana. It's been a minute. Ensign denied that we ever cooked together earlier today. And I asked him, like, what part of ratatouille don't you understand? But anyways, it's great to see you also,